Well, in this video we're going to introduce the fascinating idea of the circulation of the blood. And just before we start, we're thinking about the heart in the middle here. Now, when you're thinking about anatomy, you're always looking at someone else. So that's the left side and that's the right side, because we're looking at someone else's heart. So here we have the left side of the heart, and here we have the right side of the heart. And the heart's got two chambers, the atria at the top and the ventricles at the bottom. And we're going to start this circulatory story now. Now, I'm going to start here in this bottom chamber on the right hand side. So that is the right ventricle. So here we have blood in the right ventricle. And I'm colouring this in blue, which of course is ridiculous because blood is not blue. But for drawing diagrams of the blood, we normally do red for the oxygenated blood, the blood which is high in oxygen, and blue for the blood which is lower in oxygen. That's why I've drawn it blue. So we're in the left ventricle there. Now, if the blood is low in oxygen, where does it need to go to get oxygenated? Well, of course, it needs to go here, up to the lungs. So first of all, the blood needs to go up to the lungs. So this ventricle will contract, ejecting the blood up into the lungs, and the blood will perfuse, circulate through the lungs. And as that happens, it will be progressively oxygenated. You'll get high levels of oxygen, so we start drawing that as a red colour. So the blood is going to go to the lungs relatively low in oxygen, and it's going to return from the lungs relatively high in oxygen. Now, the vessel there between the right ventricle and the lungs, that vessel there is the pulmonary artery carrying blood to the lungs. Pulmonary means to do with the lungs. And this is the pulmonary veins. There's actually 4 of these in real life, carrying the blood from the lungs back to the heart. But we're noticing now that the blood is fully oxygenated, so we're drawing it as bright red. And that blood's going to go into the left atrium. And from there it's going to go through, there's actually a pair of valves there, it's going to go through to the left ventricle. The left ventricle. Then the left ventricle is going to contract, and that's going to eject all the blood out into the aorta, this major blood vessel. So all the blood from the left side of the heart goes to the aorta. And maybe you can see already that it was the right side of the heart that's pumping blood to the lungs. So we call the right side of the heart the lung pump. The lung pump. And as we're about to see, it's the left side of the heart that's pumping blood to the body. So all of the blood that goes to the body, apart from the lungs, which we don't count as the body, although it is part of the body, obviously, that's the lung circulation. And we're now talking about the body circulation. All the blood to the body circulation, what's sometimes called the somatic circulation, goes via the aorta. Now, this is diagrammatic, it's not anatomically accurate, but it represents what's going on. So we want the blood to go from the aorta, and it will go through various arteries, and it will go through what is called the brachial artery, and this is what takes blood into the arms. So the blood's going to go into the arms. And in the arms, the cells there are working away, so they need the oxygen. So they're going to take up the oxygen, and they're going to reduce the amount of oxygen in the blood, and they're going to put in some carbon dioxide. So once the blood is draining from the arms, in this case via the cephalic vein, then that blood is going to be deoxygenated, and it's going to be blue. Then that's going to go back to the heart via a vessel called the superior vena cava. Now, all the top half of the body is drained by the superior vena cava. So that blood's going to go back through the superior vena cava. And can you see it's going back to the heart? It's going back to the, what chamber is that? It's the right side, isn't it? And it's the atrium. So that's the right atrium. So can you see the blood that's going from the right atrium through to the right ventricle is this relatively deoxygenated blood. So that kind of describes the circulation to the arms. But then other branches from the aorta will take blood up to through the neck. The big arteries that you can feel pulsating in your neck are the carotid arteries, and they're going to take blood to the head, including, of course, the all-important brain. And again, the blood's going to perfuse through that, and as it goes through, it's going to give up some of its oxygen, it's going to collect some carbon dioxide, and then it's going to drain. And the big veins you can see in the side of your neck are the jugular veins. The jugular veins. And the jugular veins are going to drain back. And again, because it's the top half of the body, they're going to drain back into the superior vena cava. These great big cavernous veins that take the blood back to the heart. So that's all very good for the top half of the body, but of course we need a blood supply on the bottom half of the body as well. And so blood's going to go down, and we can see that blood's going to go to the liver, this vital organ in the top right hand side of the abdomen, just under the right ribs there. And the vessel taking blood there is the hepatic artery, taking blood to the liver. And the blood's going to go through the liver. As the blood goes through the liver, of course, it's going to be deoxygenated. The liver is actually very metabolically active, lots of biochemistry going on in the liver. That's going to drain from the liver via the hepatic veins, and the hepatic veins are going to drain into the big vein draining the bottom half of the body is the inferior vena cava, into the inferior vena cava, which also drains back into the right atrium before going back into the right ventricle to go to the lungs to get oxygenated again. Now, complications arise already. Now, this tube here represents the gut, or what we call the gastrointestinal tract. Basically, that's everything from your esophagus to your anus, from your food pipe all the way through your stomach, your small intestine, large intestine is represented by that tube there. And of course, it's living tissue, it's going to need a blood supply, and some of that is going via the mesenteric artery here, taking blood to the gastrointestinal tract, which is absolutely brilliant. That gets oxygenated there. And of course, as the blood goes through, it's going to give up the oxygen, pick up the carbon dioxide. So it's going to change to what we draw as blue blood, which of course is partly deoxygenated blood. Now, it's a bit of a complication here because can you see there's something called the hepatic portal vein? Now, a portal vein is a vein which connects two things without going back via the main veins. So the portal vein actually starts in capillaries and ends in capillaries. So blood is going to go from the gastrointestinal tract, and it's not going to drain back into the inferior vena cava straight away until it's gone through the liver. It has to go through the liver first. So the blood from the gut does not drain straight back into the inferior vena cava. It drains into the liver first. Why is that? Why do you think? Well, in the gastrointestinal tract, there's all sorts of bacteria. You've probably heard of these, the good bacteria, the microbiome. But they produce waste products of metabolism. And if they went straight back into the blood, they'd make you feel sick all the time. So they go to the liver first, and the liver is this biochemical processing factory. It breaks down the waste products from the bacteria. So the blood here in the hepatic portal vein is going to contain waste products from bacteria. That's going to be cleaned out by the liver, and the clean blood is going to go from the liver in the hepatic veins back into the inferior vena cava. So it's going to clean it all out. If that wasn't the case, you'd be feeling sick right now. And hopefully you're not, because your liver is doing its job. And as well as that, foods that are absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract go to the liver for processing before they go back into the systemic circulation again, the systemic circulation, the circulation for the whole body. All the systems of the body. These are all the systems of the body. Now, blood's going to carry on down through the lower part of the, going down in the aorta to the abdominal aorta, and some blood is going to go to the kidneys. In fact, a lot of blood goes to the kidneys because the kidneys are where the blood is filtered and cleaned and the urine's produced. So as the blood goes through the kidneys, again, it's going to become partly deoxygenated. The blood as it goes through the kidneys is also going to be cleaned, and the waste products from the blood are going to be excreted into the urine. So anything that the kidneys don't want kept in the blood go into the urine. Anything the kidneys want kept in the blood, they keep in the blood, and they will send back via the renal veins back into the inferior vena cava, which is taking blood back all the way up, all the way up there, all the way up there, back into the right atrium, to go to the right ventricle, to go back to the lungs to get oxygenated. And of course you want plenty of blood going to your legs so you can run and move around. So blood is going to go further down, and the main vessel taking blood into the legs are the femoral arteries, so they're taking blood to the legs. As the blood goes through the legs, it's going to give up some of its oxygen, collect carbon dioxide, then the blood is going to drain from the legs via the femoral veins. The femoral veins are going to drain back up into the abdominal cavity, into the inferior vena cava, all the way back up to the right side of the heart, the right atrium, to go to the right ventricle, to go to the lungs to get oxygenated again. So quite amazing really. We've got this whole circulatory system picking up oxygen, getting rid of carbon dioxide in the lungs, taking oxygen to the tissues, taking waste carbon dioxide from the tissues, all circulating around all the time. The brilliant, complicated, but in essence really such a simple circulatory system. So that is the essence of the circulatory system. So this is where we finished up on the last video, and by now you're going to be desperate for more detail. So let's start off by looking at the heart in a little more detail. And I'm using one of the diagrams from my physiology notes book again. Now remember that this is the left side of the heart, because you're always looking at someone else's, and this is the right side of the heart here. Just write that on to remind yourselves. Now what we did last time is we started off in the right ventricle there with relatively deoxygenated blood. The oxygen saturations in that are probably going to be about 70%, actually 75%. It's not fully deoxygenated, it's partly deoxygenated in health, but it still needs to go to the lungs to get more oxygen. So the right ventricle is going to contract. That's going to go up through that valve there called the pulmonary valve, and the blood's going to go up into the pulmonary artery. Now, why does the pulmonary artery divide into two so quickly? Well, obviously one branch goes to each lung because you've got two lungs. So that's going to go to the left lung, that's going to go to the right lung, and the blood's going to circulate through the lungs, collecting the oxygen, giving up the carbon dioxide. And then it's going to come back from the lungs via these pulmonary veins. There's 4 pulmonary veins in you, and they're draining the blood back into the left atrium. From the left atrium it's going through to the left ventricle. The left ventricle is going to contract, and that's going to send the blood out of the aorta through that valve there, the aortic valve, into the systemic circulation to the whole body, the somatic circulation. Soma is just a Greek word that means body, but that's taking blood to all the systems of the body. So if we just remind ourselves on the previous diagram, what we had was that was the pulmonary artery there, taking blood from the right ventricle to the lungs, and that's the aorta just there, taking blood from the left ventricle to the body, and that was the pulmonary veins there, taking blood from the lungs back to the left side of the heart. So that's just a bit more detail on that. Now, round about here, all this here, the muscular wall of the heart, do you know what that's called from other places? That whole muscle, big muscle in the wall of the heart. You might have come across that. That's called the myocardium. And the myocardium itself, of course, needs a blood supply. And what happens is that blood supply comes via 2 main arteries called the coronary arteries. So these are the coronary arteries here. Coronary means they look like a crown, an upside down crown of arteries. And this vessel here is the aorta. So the very first two vessels that leave the aorta are the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. So there's going to be other vessels from here, you go up to the head and the arms and all sorts of things. But the very first two blood vessels, the arterial vessels that leave the aorta, are the coronary arteries. And it's these coronary arteries, they actually go over the surface of the heart. They're not quite as thick as I've drawn them here in real life. I've drawn them a bit thicker so you can see them. But that's the left coronary artery. There's a main branch going down there called the left anterior descending branch, and one kind of goes around the back. That's called the circumflex, taking blood to the... This is taking blood to the left side of the heart. That kind of goes around the back. And this right coronary artery here is taking blood to the right side of the heart and right down to the bottom, to the inferior parts of the heart as well. But branching out, taking blood to all parts of the myocardium. So the myocardium's not really getting its blood supply from the blood that's going through the heart. It's rather getting its blood supply from these two arteries, which are the first two arteries to leave the aorta. Here and here. These coronary arteries. And this position's actually really clever, because what it means is when the heart is contracting, then the pressure in here is going to be high, and that's going to perfuse. It's going to pump blood through the coronary arteries, taking blood to that myocardium to keep the heart beating. But then, of course, in between contractions, the heart has a little rest. This is called systole and diastole. Now, when the heart is not contracting, then the blood's going to tend to come back, tends to go back. Now, the blood can't get back into the heart because this valve here is stopping it leaking back. That's the aortic valve. The aortic half-moon valve, sometimes it's called, the aortic semilunar valve. But when the blood's coming back, and it can't get back into that because that valve shut it, but the blood's still coming back, so that means the pressure of the blood in this lower part of the aorta is going to be relatively high. And that's going to carry on pumping blood through these coronary arteries, whether the heart is contracting or not. So the blood supply through the coronary arteries is actually the best continuous blood supply in the body. Because of its position, it gets blood during contraction of the heart, and they also get a blood supply during the relaxation of the heart as well. These vital coronary arteries. And of course, what we don't want to get is a blockage in these coronary arteries, because if we do, that causes a heart attack. If there's a blockage of blood in there, that's called a coronary thrombosis. A thrombosis is a blood clot where we don't want one, and the coronary is the coronary arteries, and that will lead to a heart attack, what we call a myocardial infarction, which we certainly don't want. So don't smoke, do get plenty of exercise, do eat lots of fruit and vegetables, don't eat trans fats. If you're diabetic, do manage your diabetes. If you're obese, do lose weight. Did I say smoking? If you smoke, certainly don't smoke. If you drink alcohol, certainly don't drink too much alcohol, because we don't want to clog up these absolutely essential life-giving arteries taking blood to the myocardium. Now, we did mention another particularly interesting feature in the first video, and that was this strange arrangement here, what was that called? The hepatic portal vein. That's right, it's hepatic because it's the liver. Hepatic because it's the liver. It's a vein because it's taking blood back to the heart, that little vein there. So an artery is any vessel carrying blood away from the heart, a vein is any vessel carrying blood back towards the heart, so it's certainly a vein. But it's portal because it's a vein that ends in capillaries. So most veins, of course, drain into bigger veins, but that one ends in capillaries. Let's just look at that in more detail. And here we see that here. Again, diagram from the physiology notes book. So here we have the gastrointestinal tract, which isn't green, but I'm going to draw it green. So that's the gastrointestinal tract there, the gut. All the way from the food pipe through to the very back part of the colon, through to the rectum, the gastrointestinal tract. the gut, the digestive system. Now, the blood that's draining the gut is collected in all these little capillaries, these small veins here, draining the gastrointestinal tract. And that blood all goes back to the hepatic portal vein. And that means the blood can go through the liver before it drains back into the larger systemic veins. So we can see here the blood's being sort of transported to various parts of the liver. And this blood is going to come into intimate contact, very intimate, close contact with the cells in the liver, the individual cells in the liver which are going to break down the toxins. Individual liver cells called hepatocytes. Hepatocytes, the liver cells. Cytes means cells. Hepato or hepatic, to do with the liver. That's why that's the hepatic portal vein, to do with the liver. So in the gastrointestinal tract, there's all sorts of bacteria live there, and they produce bacterial toxins. Now, if these went straight back into the blood, because they're toxins, they make you feel sick. So they need filtered out first. This liver's this wonderful cleaning system, breaking down all the toxins. And also, foods need to be processed. So obviously, food is going to be absorbed. Proteins and sugars are going to be absorbed directly from the wall of the gut. The fats actually kind of go a different way around, but the proteins and the water-soluble vitamins and the carbohydrates are all going to go straight to the liver for processing. So just to give one example, there's different sorts of sugar can be absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract because there's different types of sugar in the diet, but the only sort of sugar that leaves the liver to go back into the systemic venous circulation is glucose. That's the physiological sugar that we need. So all sorts of sugars might enter the hepatic portal vein there, but only glucose is going to leave via the hepatic veins. A vital role of the liver. And then the other diagram we use quite a lot is this one, and that is really we could have started off with this one because it's a simplified version of all of this one really that we've looked at. So what happens here is the blood, let's start in the left ventricle this time, blood from the left ventricle through all the systemic arteries into the body, all parts of the body. That includes the brain, the big toe, the kidney, the liver, the gastrointestinal tract, everything. Blood is deoxygenated, collects carbon dioxide, goes back via the systemic veins to the inferior and superior vena cava, into the right atrium, through to the right ventricle, out to the lungs. Relatively deoxygenated blood arrives in the lungs, gets oxygenated as it goes through the lungs, and that goes back via the pulmonary veins to the left atrium to go to the right ventricle again. So in essence, it's just so simple. And yet such an anatomically complicated arrangement, this constant circulation of the blood. And it's interesting to note that all of the blood can circulate around all of the body in a 1 minute period, constantly circulating, transporting oxygen, transporting nutrients, distributing heat, taking waste products away from the cells to the kidney and the liver to be metabolized and excreted, and just maintaining this wonderful even state of homeostasis throughout the body. Now, to finish off the story on this diagram, the blood from the aorta, as we've said, is going to go around all of the arteries of the body. So the aorta is going to break into progressively smaller arteries. That's going to break into the microscopic arteries we call arterioles. The blood's going to go through the capillaries, perfusing through the capillaries, draining in the venules, going into veins that are progressively larger veins until we get to the superior and the inferior vena cava. So the superior vena cava is draining the top half of the body, and the inferior vena cava is draining the bottom half of the body. Now the blood started off as bright red in the aorta, As it's gone through the tissues of the body, it's given up oxygen to the tissues of the body, it's collected the waste carbon dioxide generated by metabolism in those same cells and tissues of the body. And so it's going to come back to the right side of the heart via the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava as relatively deoxygenated blood. And the oxygen saturations have dropped by about 25 or 30%. So when the blood is leaving in the aorta here, we can actually detect this oxygen saturations here with our fingertip probes. And typically it's about, let's say 96 to about 98. Well, depends. If you take a few deep breaths, we'll go up to 100% in you. So 96 to 100 would be about normal. But by the time it gets back into the right side of the heart in the systemic veins, it's probably dropped down to about 70% or 70-75%. If you're exercising and you're taking more of that oxygen out of the blood, then that's going to drop further. But it's not fully deoxygenated when it goes back to the lungs. So we've kind of got a bit of reserve, which is a good thing here. So that's that full story. Now, the atria of the heart and the ventricles of the heart are contracting pretty well at the same time. So they're contracting like that. And they're contracting like that. Pretty well at the same time. Well, at the same time, really. So the heart is coordinated. And it's interesting to think about what is actually being pumped out here, because what we have here, this blood coming out of the aorta, that's going to be the systemic circulation blood pressure. And of course we measure this when we take blood pressures on this series of videos that go through in great detail how to take blood pressure. And when the heart is contracting, that's called systole, when the ventricle is actually in the act of contracting. The pressure in here is going to be high. That's going to force the blood into there at high pressure. And in you, that's probably about 120 millimeters of mercury. We measure this in millimeters of mercury. And again, if you watch the blood pressure video, you'll see why. It's the way we used to do it. But then the heart's going to relax. And it needs to relax so that the pressure in here will go down. And when the pressure in here in the left ventricle goes down, that allows the blood from the pulmonary veins to get back in, and the blood from the left atrium to get back in to refill the ventricle. It's absolutely essential that happens. And when that happens, the blood pressure in the arterial system doesn't drop to nothing, because the arteries are elastic. So when the blood is pumped out during systole, it's going to expand the arteries like that. But then the arterial walls are naturally elastic and they're going to recoil back in. And as they recoil back in, that's going to maintain the pressure in the arterial system. And that's the pressure in the arterial system when the ventricle is not contracting, during disystole, when the heart is not contracting, and that'll go down to about 80. Or actually, hopefully a bit less than that. I mean, people have talked about standard blood pressures being 120 over 80 for years now. But if you're young and fit, I'd like to think your blood pressure is about 110 over 60 or 65 if you're young and fit. Because really, the lower your blood pressure, for many different reasons, the better. As long as you don't fall over, as long as you don't get dizzy when you stand up, and as long as you can produce urine, then it's actually healthy to have a lower blood pressure. So do get plenty of exercise, do not put weight on, don't eat too much salt, do eat plenty of fruit and vegetables and things containing potassium, and try and keep that blood pressure relatively low, because that's much better for you. Now, the blood pressure is the pressure in the systemic arteries, and the blood pressure is determined by the cardiac output multiplied by the systemic vascular resistance. Systemic vascular resistance. So the blood pressure is the pressure of the blood against the walls of the vessel in which it's contained. And that's determined by cardiac output. And cardiac output is the volume of blood pumped out in a 1 minute period. So the blood pressure is equal to cardiac output, and cardiac output itself equals the heart rate times the stroke volume. So the cardiac output we're talking about the left side of the heart here. We'll talk about the right side in a minute. And the left side of the heart, for the systemic circulation, the cardiac output is the volume of blood pumped out in a 1 minute period. And that equals the heart rate, that's the number of times the heart beats per minute. And the stroke volume is how much blood is in that left ventricle when it contracts. Now, typically in you, when you're at rest, there's going to be about 70 mils. So in other words, cardiac output is going to equal, if your heart rate is 70, it's going to be 70 times 70. So if the heart's beating 70 times a minute, each time it's pumping out 70 mils of blood, that will give you 4,900 mils, which is a cardiac output of, well, it's going to be 4,900 mils, isn't it? At almost 5 litres. It's about 5 litres of blood being pumped out per contraction. Now, of course, the amount of blood being pumped out by the right side of the heart is going to be exactly the same. The volumes of blood pumped out by the right side and the left side are going to be identical. Otherwise, the lungs would fill up and the body would empty of blood, or the body would empty and the lungs would fill up, neither of which, of course, are desirable situations. But we do always notice in these diagrams that and indeed in life, that the left ventricle, the wall of the left ventricular myocardium, remember the myocardium is this heart muscle, it's much thicker than in the right. That's because it's not far to go to the lungs. The lungs are quite close. The lungs are just here in the chest on either side of the heart. So there's not very far for the blood to go. So the normal pressure in the pulmonary artery here might only be, say, 20 when the heart's contracting, and that might drop down to about 12 when the heart's relaxing. So much lower pressures, 20 over 12 as opposed to 120 over 80, as this blood goes to the lungs, but at a much shorter distance. So it's very useful to think of this physiology, because the cardiac output is the heart rate times the stroke volume. There. But we notice that cardiac output is only one component of blood pressure. There's also the systemic vascular resistance. And that is the resistance generated by all the arterial system. So the more narrow the arterial system, the harder it is for the blood to get through and the higher the pressure. So vasoconstriction is going to raise blood pressure. Then if the blood vessels dilate, they get wider. It's now easier for the blood to get through because it's wider, and that's going to tend to lower the systemic vascular resistance and therefore lower the blood pressure. So we've mentioned that there's 5 litres of blood approximately coming out per minute. Quite amazing, really. Now, how much blood have we got altogether? Well, that kind of depends on how big you are and whether you're male or female. But most people will only have about 5 litres of blood in their whole body. So if there's 5 litres of blood in the whole body, and there's 5 litres of blood being pumped out by the left ventricle per minute, because it's 70 times 70, then can you see on average, the entire volume of the blood is going through the left side of the heart per minute, and therefore by necessity the same volume of blood is going through the right heart per minute. Quite amazing. Now, if you'd like to know how much blood you've got, you can work it out, because if you're a female, then you can assume you've got about 65 mils of blood per kilogram. So pop to the scales, weigh yourself. If you're a lady, 65 mils. So if you weigh 60 kilograms, it would be 60 times 65. Now, if you're male, you've got a bit more. That's about 75 mils per kilogram. Now, why is it that men have got more blood than women per kilogram of body weight? This doesn't seem fair, does it? We don't want to be sexist here, do we? And yet this is the physiology of the matter. And the reason is that women have proportionately more adipose tissue than men. Men have proportionately more muscle tissue compared to women having more adipose fatty tissue. And the fatty tissues of the body are not well perfused with blood. They have much less blood. If you're a child, depends how old you are, but if you're an infant, you've got about 80 mils per kilogram for young children. And if you're a neonate, well, you probably wouldn't be watching the video if you're a neonate, but if you are working with neonates, they've got about 85 mils of blood per kilogram. And premature babies have more, that they have about 96, and fetuses have about 96 mils of blood per kilogram. But of course, if you're overweight, so if you're male or female and you're overweight, if you're a man, it's going to be, if you're overweight, it's going to be less than 75 mils a kilogram. So if you're very overweight, you might only have 60 or 50 mils of blood per kilogram, which would mean it would be best to lose some weight. And the same for females as well. It would be if females are overweight, if they have too much adipose tissue has proportionately less blood going through it. So again, it would be less than 65. So a very overweight female might only have 45 mils of blood per kilogram or something like that. But if you're reasonably good body weight, then it'd be interesting to calculate your particular blood volume. And having the amazing knowledge that each side of the heart is pumping out that total blood volume in a 1 minute period.